June 18, 1815. While soldiers die at Waterloo, a banker in London makes the equivalent of $600 billion in one day. He didn't fight. He didn't manufacture weapons. He controlled information. And he understood something most people still don't understand today. War is the most profitable business in human history, not for the soldiers, for the men who finance it. For 250 years, every major war has followed the same pattern. Governments borrow trillions, banks loan it, soldiers fight, wars end. But the debt never disappears. It compounds. And your taxes pay interest forever on money borrowed to fight wars that ended before you were born. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented financial history. The same families, the same banks, the same mechanism, repeated across centuries. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how the system works, who built it, who profits from it, and why wars keep happening while government debt keeps growing. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let me take you back to that moment in London. Nathan Mayer Rothschild standing on the floor of the London Stock Exchange. Napoleon has just been defeated at Waterloo, but no one in England knows it yet. Rothschild's private courier network, faster than any government's, has delivered the news first. He begins selling British government bonds, massive quantities. Other traders watch in horror. If Rothschild is selling, something must be catastrophically wrong. They assume Napoleon won. Britain is finished. British bonds are worthless. Panic spreads. Everyone sells. The price collapses. Then Rothschild reverses. He buys everything at the bottom. Within hours, official news arrives. Britain won. Bond prices soar. Rothschild has just made a fortune that would equal $600 billion today, in one day. But here's what matters more than the trade itself. Rothschild didn't just profit from the war, he financed it. Both sides. The Rothschild banking family had loaned money to Britain to fight Napoleon. They had also loaned to various German states, fighting alongside Britain. And through their Frankfurt branch, they maintained relationships with French financial interests. This is the mechanism. When nations go to war, they need money immediately, before they can collect taxes, before they can requisition supplies. They borrow it, and whoever loans it profits regardless of who wins. This pattern didn't end in 1815. This became the blueprint for the modern world. Every major war for the past 250 years has been financed by international banking houses. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Wars cost trillions of dollars. Governments don't have trillions in cash. They borrow it, and whoever loans it makes a profit that compounds for generations. Right now, December 2025, the United States has $36 trillion in national debt. Of that, $8.1 trillion was added since 2001 to finance the war on terror. Iraq and Afghanistan cost $8 trillion total when you include long-term veteran care and interest on borrowed money. The wars ended in 2021. The debt remains, and every year, American taxpayers send $1.13 trillion to bondholders as interest payments. The wars are over. The soldiers came home. The interest payments continue. This is the system. Wars are financed with debt. The debt never gets repaid. It compounds, and the people who loan the money profit forever. Now let me show you exactly how this system was created, starting with the man who perfected it. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1744. He started as a dealer in rare coins and precious metals. But Rothschild understood something that would make his family the richest in Europe. He understood that governments at war need money immediately, and whoever can provide that money fastest controls the government. In the 1790s, Europe was convulsed by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Governments needed gold and silver to pay armies. Rothschild positioned himself as the intermediary. He would loan money to governments, take government bonds as collateral, and arrange for the transfer of gold across borders even during wartime. But Rothschild's real innovation was creating a network. He had 5 sons. He sent them to 5 European financial centers: Amschel to Frankfurt, Salomon to Vienna, Nathan to London, Karl to Naples, James to Paris. The 5 brothers operated as one financial entity. They could move money across borders faster than any government. They could loan to multiple sides of the same conflict, and they could profit from information advantages because their courier network was faster than official government channels. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, cost approximately $7 billion in period money, equivalent to over $200 billion today. Britain alone borrowed $1.6 billion, roughly $180 billion in today's money. Where did Britain borrow this money? From banking houses, primarily the Rothschilds, Barings, and other merchant banks. The mechanism was government bonds. Britain issued bonds paying 5% annual interest. Banks bought the bonds, providing cash to the government immediately. The government used the cash to pay soldiers and buy supplies. The war ended in 1815, but the bonds remained outstanding. Britain paid 5% interest every year for decades. By 1855, 40 years after Waterloo, Britain had paid more in interest than the original loan amount, but the principal remained unpaid. This is the essential mechanism of war finance. The war is temporary. The debt is permanent. The banker loans money once and collects interest forever. When Nathan Rothschild died in 1836, his wealth was estimated at $5 million, equivalent to $400 billion in today's money adjusted for economic power. He was the richest private individual in the world, and the wealth came primarily from government bonds issued during the Napoleonic Wars. But the Rothschilds didn't just profit, they shaped policy. In 1825, France needed a loan to pay war indemnities. The Rothschild Bank arranged it, but demanded policy concessions. In 1830, Belgium needed recognition and loans after breaking from the Netherlands. The Rothschilds arranged it, and Belgium's government followed Rothschild financial advice for decades. Whoever controls the money controls the policy. This pattern repeated throughout the 19th century. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, was financed by bond issues in London and Paris, underwritten by Rothschild, Barings, and others. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was financed by both Union and Confederate bonds. The Union issued $2.6 billion in bonds, equivalent to $65 billion today. The Confederacy issued bonds sold primarily in Europe. Banking houses bought them, profited from interest. And when the Confederacy lost, those bondholders lost their investment. But the Union bonds remained outstanding. They were paid in full with interest over decades. Now watch how this system scaled to unprecedented levels in World War I. When war broke out in August 1914, every combatant nation faced the same problem. The war would cost far more than any government had in reserves. Germany's gold reserves, $250 million. France's gold reserves, $680 million. Britain's gold reserves, $170 million, but the war would cost tens of billions of dollars per year. All combatants turned to the same solution: borrow, issue government bonds, sell them to banks and citizens, use the cash to fight, pay back later. But there was a problem. European banks couldn't finance the entire war. The scale was too large. There was only one place with enough capital, the United States. And there was one bank with the capacity to arrange loans of the necessary size: J.P. Morgan and Company. In 1915, Britain and France were buying massive quantities of war materials from American companies: shells, guns, explosives, food, uniforms. But they were running out of money. They needed loans. The United States was officially neutral. But American banks were free to loan to belligerents. J.P. Morgan and Company became the official purchasing agent for the British and French governments in the United States. This meant every purchase Britain and France made went through Morgan, and Morgan arranged the financing. In January 1915, Morgan arranged a $12 million loan to France. In August 1915, Morgan arranged a $500 million loan to Britain and France, the largest loan in history at that time. In total, between 1915 and 1917, J.P. Morgan arranged over $3 billion in loans to Britain and France, equivalent to over $90 billion today. The terms were profitable. The loans carried 5% interest. But Morgan also received commissions on every transaction. Estimated total commissions to Morgan, over $30 million, equivalent to $900 million today. And the Morgan Bank bought portions of the bonds themselves, earning interest. But here's the critical part. Morgan didn't just arrange loans. Morgan became invested in the outcome. If Britain and France lost the war, they couldn't repay. Morgan would lose billions. So, Morgan had a direct financial interest in ensuring Britain and France won. And in April 1917, the United States entered the war on the side of Britain and France. Historians debate why America entered. Unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmerman telegram, democratic ideals. But there's another factor rarely discussed. If Britain and France lost, American banks would lose billions in defaulted loans. When America entered the war, it guaranteed Britain and France wouldn't lose, and it guaranteed American banks would be repaid. After the war ended in November 1918, the debts remained. Britain owed the United States $4.7 billion. France owed $4 billion. Italy owed $2 billion. Russia, which had collapsed into revolution, owed $192 million but never repaid. Total Allied debt to the United States, over $11 billion, equivalent to $200 billion today. These debts were restructured but never forgiven. Britain made its final World War I debt payment to the United States in 2015, 97 years after the war ended. France defaulted in 1932 and never fully repaid. But the American banks that arranged the loans had already profited enormously from commissions and interest paid during and immediately after the war. And the debts created a financial interdependence. Britain owed America. Germany owed Britain and France in reparations. The entire European economy became a web of unpayable debts. This contributed directly to the Great Depression and the rise of Hitler. But the biggest change from World War I was the creation of a system where wars would be financed not by banks alone, but by central banks. Let me show you how World War II completed this transformation. When World War II began in 1939, governments had learned from World War I. They couldn't rely on private banks alone. They needed central banks that could create money to finance the war directly. In the United States, the Federal Reserve, created in 1913, became the mechanism for war finance. The U.S. government issued Treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve bought the bonds by creating new money. This is called monetizing the debt. The government received cash immediately. The Fed held the bonds, earning interest, and the money supply expanded dramatically. Between 1940 and 1945, U.S. federal debt exploded from $43 billion to $259 billion, a 6 times increase in 5 years. The money was created by the Federal Reserve purchasing government bonds. This was direct money printing to finance war. Britain did the same. Between 1939 and 1945, British government debt increased from $7 billion to $24 billion, a 3.4 times increase. The Bank of England created money to buy government bonds. Germany did the same. The Reichsbank printed money to finance the Wehrmacht. By 1945, Germany's money supply had increased 8 times from pre-war levels. Every combatant printed money to finance the war. And when the war ended, the debt remained. But it was now owed to central banks, which are quasi-governmental entities. This created a new system. Government debt became permanent, held by central banks, which create money to buy the debt, which creates inflation, which reduces the real value of the debt over time. This is the modern system. Governments borrow to finance wars. Central banks create money to buy the debt. The debt never gets repaid in real terms. It inflates away, and the population pays through the hidden tax of inflation. After World War II, total global government debt was over $1 trillion, equivalent to $16 trillion today. The largest debtor was the United States, which owed $259 billion, mostly to the Federal Reserve and American bondholders. But World War II created something even more significant than debt. It created the modern international monetary system, designed to ensure debt would be repayable in dollars. In July 1944, representatives from 44 nations met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The purpose was to design the post-war international monetary system. The system they created has defined global finance for 80 years. The Bretton Woods Agreement established the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. This meant the dollar was as good as gold, and it meant every nation needed dollars to trade internationally. But here's what this really meant for debt. All the war debts owed by Britain, France, China, and others were denominated in dollars. To repay these debts, countries needed to earn dollars through trade or borrow more dollars. This created permanent dollar demand. The United States had won World War II militarily. But Bretton Woods ensured America won financially. The dollar became the global currency. American banks became the lenders to the world, and war debts ensured a flow of payments from Europe to America for decades. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both created at Bretton Woods, became mechanisms for extending dollar loans to countries. Creating a global debt system, countries that couldn't repay would restructure, borrow more, and remain in permanent debt. This is how war debt built the modern financial system, a system where debt is permanent, denominated in dollars, and ensures wealth flows to creditors in perpetuity. Now let me show you how the system has operated since 1945, because every major war has followed the same pattern. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, cost the United States $450 billion in today's dollars. It was financed entirely with debt. U.S. federal debt increased from $257 billion in 1950 to $266 billion in 1953. The debt remained and compounded. The Vietnam War, 1965 to 1973, cost the United States $1 trillion in today's dollars. It was financed entirely with debt. U.S. federal debt increased from $317 billion in 1965 to $458 billion in 1973. The war ended, the debt remained, and the inflation created by war financing contributed to the economic crisis of the 1970s. The Gulf War, 1990 to 1991, cost $102 billion in today's dollars. But this war was partially financed by allies. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other Gulf states paid $54 billion. The U.S. only borrowed $48 billion. This was unusual. Most wars are fully debt-financed. The War on Terror, 2001 to 2021, cost the United States $8 trillion. Iraq and Afghanistan cost $2.3 trillion in direct spending. Long-term costs, including veteran care and interest on borrowed money, bring the total to $8 trillion. How was it financed? Entirely with debt. U.S. federal debt increased from $5.8 trillion in 2001 to $28.4 trillion in 2021. Not all of that increase was war spending, but $8 trillion was. In December 2024, the United States is still paying interest on money borrowed to finance wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The wars ended in 2021, but the debt remains. The soldiers came home. The interest payments continue. At current interest rates, the U.S. pays approximately $320 billion per year in interest on the $8 trillion borrowed for the War on Terror. Over 30 years, that's $9.6 trillion in interest payments on an $8 trillion war. This is the system. Wars are financed with debt. The debt compounds. The interest is paid forever, and the people who arrange the loans profit in perpetuity. Now let me show you who specifically profited, because these aren't abstract institutions. These are families and firms whose wealth was built on war debt. The Rothschild family fortune, built primarily on Napoleonic war financing, persists today. The Rothschild banking empire split into French and British branches. Rothschild & Co., the French branch, has assets of $114 billion as of 2024. The British branch, through various entities, controls assets estimated at $60 billion combined, $174 billion in assets traceable to a banking dynasty built on war finance. The Morgan family fortune, built on World War I financing, persists through J.P. Morgan Chase. Now the largest bank in the United States with $3.9 trillion in assets. While no individual Morgan family member controls the bank today, the institution built by J.P. Morgan on war financing dominates American finance. The Warburg family, which played crucial roles in financing both world wars through their positions in banking in Germany and the United States, built wealth estimated at over $10 billion today across various descendants and institutions. Beyond individual families, the institutions created to finance wars became permanent. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913 partially to facilitate government borrowing for potential war, now holds $4.8 trillion in Treasury securities, much of it from war financing. The interest on those bonds, paid by taxpayers, flows to the Federal Reserve, which remits profits to the Treasury but keeps enough to operate and pay dividends to member banks. Investment banks that underwrite government bonds profit from every war. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Citigroup, J.P. Morgan Chase. These banks earn fees on every Treasury bond auction. When the government needs to borrow $2 trillion to finance a war, these banks arrange it and collect approximately 0.5% to 1% in fees. That's $10 billion to $20 billion in fees for arranging a $2 trillion war loan. Defense contractors profit from wars directly. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon. But banks profit indirectly by financing the debt that pays the defense contractors. It's a circular system. The government borrows from banks to pay defense contractors. The defense contractors deposit profits in banks. The banks hold government bonds earning interest. Everyone profits except the taxpayer, who pays interest forever. Now let me show you the mathematical mechanism of how war debt compounds. In 2001, U.S. federal debt was $5.8 trillion. The Iraq War began in 2003. Between 2003 and 2011, the Iraq War cost approximately $2 trillion. This was financed entirely with borrowed money. The government issued treasury bonds. Banks in foreign countries bought them. The government received cash immediately. Those bonds pay interest. Average interest rate, 3%. On $2 trillion, that's $60 billion a year in interest payments. The Iraq War officially ended in 2011, though U.S. forces remained. But the interest payments continued. From 2011 to 2024, that's 13 years. At $60 billion per year, that's $780 billion in interest paid on a $2 trillion war. But it gets worse. Because the government never paid back the $2 trillion principal, the debt is still outstanding. By 2024, that $2 trillion from the Iraq War has generated $1.08 trillion in interest payments since the war began. And the principal is still owed. Over 30 years, a typical bond maturity, the government will pay $1.8 trillion in interest on the $2 trillion borrowed. Total cost, $3.8 trillion for a $2 trillion war, but even that understates it, because the government refinances the debt. When bonds mature, the government issues new bonds to pay off the old ones. The principal never gets repaid. It just rolls over indefinitely. So the interest payments continue forever. The Iraq War, which cost $2 trillion, will ultimately cost $5 trillion or more over 50 years, when you include compounding interest on debt that never gets repaid. And who receives that $3 trillion in interest? Bondholders, banks, foreign governments, pension funds, wealthy individuals. They loaned money once in 2003. They collect interest forever. This is the system. War debt never gets repaid. It gets refinanced indefinitely, and the interest compounds forever. Now, let me show you the modern implications because this system is still operating right now. U.S. federal debt in December 2024, $36.2 trillion. Interest payments in 2024, $1.13 trillion. That's the third largest federal expenditure after Social Security and Medicare. It's larger than defense spending. Of that $36.2 trillion, approximately $15 trillion was added since 2001 for various wars, financial crisis bailouts, and COVID spending, all financed with debt, none repaid, all generating permanent interest payments. Who holds this debt? Foreign governments hold $8.1 trillion. China holds $795 billion. Japan holds $1.1 trillion. The Federal Reserve holds $4.8 trillion. Domestic investors, banks, and pension funds hold the rest. Every year, the U.S. government sends $1.13 trillion to these bondholders. Of that, approximately $320 billion is interest on debt borrowed for the war on terror. That money flows from American taxpayers to bondholders in perpetuity, and the debt keeps growing. The 2024 federal deficit, $1.9 trillion. The government is borrowing $1.9 trillion this year alone, some for normal operations, some for emergencies, but all adding to the permanent debt stock that generates permanent interest payments. This is the system built by war financing. Governments borrow to finance wars. The debt never gets repaid. It compounds, and the wealth flows from taxpayers to bondholders forever. And here's the critical insight. This system incentivizes war, not consciously, not explicitly, but structurally. Wars create enormous borrowing needs. Borrowing creates profits for banks. Banks have lobbyists. Defense contractors have lobbyists. The financial incentive structure favors conflict over peace. I'm not claiming wars happen solely because banks profit. Wars have complex causes involving geopolitics, ideology, resources, and power. But the financial system built over 250 years of war financing creates interests that benefit from conflict, and those interests have influence over policy. The military-industrial complex President Eisenhower warned about in 1961 isn't just defense contractors. It's the financial system that profits from the debt used to pay defense contractors. Lockheed Martin makes money building planes. J.P. Morgan Chase makes money arranging the bonds that pay for the planes. Both benefit from military spending. Both lobby for it. Now let me show you what happens in the next war, because the pattern will repeat. If the United States goes to war with China over Taiwan, the estimated cost is $2 trillion to $5 trillion, depending on duration. The government doesn't have $2 trillion in cash. It will borrow. Investment banks will arrange the loans. The Federal Reserve will buy bonds by creating money. The debt will be added to the national total, which will exceed $40 trillion. Interest payments will exceed $1.5 trillion annually. And 30 years after the war ends, taxpayers will still be paying interest on money borrowed to fight it. If there's a major Middle East war involving Iran, estimated cost $1 trillion to $3 trillion. Same mechanism, borrow, fight, never repay. Compound interest forever. If there's a conflict in Eastern Europe, estimated cost $500 billion to $2 trillion. Same pattern. Every future war will follow this pattern because this is the system. Wars are too expensive to pay for with existing revenue. Governments borrow. The debt becomes permanent. The interest compounds. And wealth flows from taxpayers to bondholders in perpetuity. So what does this mean for you? First, understand that the national debt is not abstract. It's money borrowed that must be repaid with interest, and you're the one repaying it through taxes. Every dollar of the $36.2 trillion in federal debt represents a future tax obligation. Your tax dollars, your children's tax dollars, your grandchildren's tax dollars, all paying interest on money borrowed decades ago for wars that ended before they were born. Second, recognize that inflation is a form of war financing. When central banks create money to buy government bonds, they increase the money supply. More money chasing the same goods means higher prices. Inflation is how governments partially default on debt without officially defaulting. They borrow $1 trillion, repay it in dollars that are worth less due to inflation. You pay through reduced purchasing power. Third, understand that the system benefits bondholders at the expense of wage earners. If you earn a salary, you pay taxes that fund interest payments. If you own government bonds, you receive interest funded by tax dollars. The system transfers wealth from workers to asset owners. If you want to position yourself on the receiving end rather than the paying end, own treasury bonds or other government debt instruments. At least collect some of the interest you're paying. Fourth, recognize that government debt crowds out productive investment. Every dollar the government borrows is a dollar that could have been invested in private businesses that create jobs and innovation. War debt, which produces no economic return, diverts capital from productive uses. The opportunity cost of $36.2 trillion in national debt is the businesses, technologies, and innovations that were never funded because capital went to finance wars instead. Fifth, vote and advocate accordingly. The system perpetuates because voters don't understand it. Politicians can finance wars with debt, and voters don't feel the immediate cost. It's only years later, when interest payments consume the budget, that the cost becomes apparent. If you understand the system, demand that wars be paid for with current taxes, not borrowed money. If a war is important enough to fight, it's important enough to pay for immediately. Debt financing hides the true cost and makes wars easier to start. Sixth, prepare for the next crisis. The debt is unsustainable. At some point, either through inflation, default, or restructuring, the debt burden will be reduced. When that happens, bondholders will lose wealth. The currency will lose value, or some combination. If you hold only cash and bonds, you're vulnerable. Diversify into assets that hold value through currency crisis, real estate, commodities, equities in productive businesses, things that have intrinsic value beyond government promises. Seventh, study financial history. The pattern repeats because most people don't know what happened before. The Napoleonic Wars were financed with debt that took generations to repay. World War I was financed with debt that contributed to the Depression. World War II was financed with debt that built the modern monetary system. Every war follows the same pattern. If you understand the pattern, you can position yourself accordingly. The lesson from 250 years of war financing is simple. Wars are profitable for those who finance them. Governments borrow. Banks loan. Wars end. Debts remain. Interest compounds. And wealth flows from taxpayers to bondholders forever. This system was built deliberately by the smartest financial minds over centuries. Meyer Rothschild perfected it, financing the Napoleonic Wars. J.P. Morgan scaled it to industrial proportions, financing World War I. The Federal Reserve institutionalized it by becoming the permanent buyer of government debt. And the Bretton Woods system globalized it by making the dollar the world's reserve currency and denominating all debts in dollars. The system persists because it's profitable for those with influence. Banks profit from underwriting fees. Bondholders profit from interest. Defense contractors profit from the spending, and politicians profit from being able to fight wars without immediately raising taxes, pushing the cost onto future generations. You live inside this system. You pay for it with taxes and inflation. And unless you understand how it works, you'll remain on the paying side while others collect interest on debt borrowed to fight wars decades ago. The international bankers who funded the world's wars didn't do it out of patriotism. They did it for profit. And the system they built, where wars create permanent debt that generates permanent interest payments, has transferred trillions of dollars from taxpayers to bondholders over 250 years. The next war will follow the same pattern. The government will borrow trillions. Banks will arrange it. The war will end. The debt will remain. Your children will pay interest on it for their entire lives. And the people who arrange the loans will profit. Now you know how the system works. Now you understand the mechanism. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you remain on the paying side, funding interest payments through your taxes while others collect? Or will you position yourself to understand and navigate this system? Share this video with someone who needs to understand how war financing works. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the debt system. And subscribe, because we're going to keep exposing the mechanisms of money and power that most people never learn. Understanding the system is the first step to protecting yourself from it.